Welcome back, everybody. I'm Carter Sandvin, and this is the channel for Sandbox Illustration. So, I fucked up. I goofed when I was recording my previous video for my Junkpile. I concluded it because the video came to a beautiful ending. But then I realized I forgot what was going to be like half of the video because it wasn't going to be just an art Junkpile, it was also going to be a story Junkpile. Because in this journal right here, I have a bunch of stories that I've kind of scrapped. And I don't want to change the previous video because I think that one went beautifully. So I'm just here to, I guess, make a part 2 to my Junkpile. The first one was all about art. This one is all going to be about writing because I'm going to be discussing some old story ideas that I've had in the past. And I'm going to be discussing why I'm not making them anymore, what's changed about it, and then at some point in the future as well, I'm going to be making a video discussing what I've learned in writing, what I've learned as an up-and-coming writer, and little tips and tricks that have helped me to try and craft a solid, unified story. So that's going to be its own video though. For now, we're just going to be discussing some ideas that I've thrown out in the past and why I did so. So I think I'm just going to make the disclaimer now. The reason that I threw out these videos was because, well, for one, back when I threw them out, I just decided, this is getting a little messy, because actually, I had a universe of comics that I wanted to make, and it got kind of messy with its continuity, and that's why I threw it out. But the reason that I'm not bringing it back is because everything with these stories is just poorly written, and I'll get into that a little bit. I don't want to take too much away from that other video that I'm going to be making. At the time, I just didn't know how to write. I didn't know how to make a story, if you get what I mean. So we're going to get into that today. So the Tales of L is the first one. Now, Tales of L was all about this world called Elemorge that I created. Or actually, no, the world was called L. But it's all about the magic of element bending. I considered there to be 6 core magic elements. Instead of just earth, air, water, and fire, I added light and darkness. And that was what this whole world was about, was like different groups and kingdoms that all controlled these elements, and darkness kind of being the evil one, of course, shocker. And Tales of L specifically was an anthology series discussing like the growth of this world. So it showed like different wars, it talked about like a group of thieves at one point, another one was showing like this world's industrial revolution and all that. That's what Tales of L was about, and then under that is specifically Elemorge. Now, the name Elemorge, or that term, translated to like the study of element bending. So the story Elemorge is all about, you have 6 kids, right? 6 kids that are all from the same town, and they were all put there for a reason, you know? These 6 kids, all of their surrogate parents moved to this one town because it turned out that they were all actually descendants of the gods of the elements. So like there was a god for each element, and each of the kids were all children of those gods. The god of darkness, he was coming back and he was about to destroy the planet, so they had to step up, take the throne, and then defeat him themselves. That's what the whole story was about. And then under that is Artisans. So the Artisans came after all of the Elemorge storyline because it took place after the apocalypse of that world. That world all ended. There was a big civil war that occurred, and L as a land became completely destroyed. So they had a little plan in mind where they would send at the time, they had like stones that all encapsulated the power of the elements, and they would send those to Earth so that even though their world is dying, the magic itself doesn't have to die necessarily. And then Artisans is all about kids coming together and discovering that they were also descendants of some of the magic users from L, or at least they had some kind of blood connection. And so they all rose in this world to be these superheroes that each of them controlled a unique element. So I believe that's all that there is to say about the Artisans. So the next one on this list is The Revolution of Thornton Falls. The Revolution of Thornton Falls is about a kid named Darren who moves to this new town, obviously just trying to find his way around, and then he meets this group of kids that are all run by a kid named, I believe his name was Quentin. His name was Quentin, that's right. By the way, that name isn't off of Gravity Falls, it's off of Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls is a town in my home state. That's what I based it off of, not Gravity Falls. But anyway, so this kid Quentin and 3 other kids, I can't remember their names right now. Oh, it was Elena, Anna, and Itch. Those 3 kids plus Darren and Quentin all came together to try and have this whole organization off of trying to bring the town of Thornton Falls back to its original state where the town was clean, you could trust everybody that was there, because they came to learn that this one family was completely taking over the town and they were making it impossibly corrupt at every single level. Their youngest son, Chuck, is like the school bully. Him and his posse, they bully everybody at the school relentlessly. So their first one is they're trying to take down Chuck, of course. But then the next one is their older son. He has been running this whole like illegal drug thing behind the scenes at the town. Their mom runs the school, so she kind of let Chuck do whatever she wanted. And the dad was actually the mayor of the town. So again, kind of let the son do whatever he wanted to, or at least he didn't make it public. He at least didn't like mention anything going on with like drug crimes and stuff, because that's what his son was doing. So this whole family was just completely destroying this town. Quentin wanted to try and bring it back, but then you soon learn that there was a big problem where there was a power struggle between Quentin and Darren. Darren genuinely wanted to try and bring Thornton Falls back to a good place because that was his new home now. He didn't want to grow up in a horrible condition. He had clear intentions with it, but Quentin, you actually come to learn, is kind of spiteful, and it turns out that his parents actually ran the town for a little bit, and he's really upset by how it's going and that he's kind of lost his grasp on the town. So you see, in fact, one of the issues that I have for it, because it's got multiple issues, issue 4 is called Civil War, because that's all about Darren calling out Quentin and saying like, you're not fit to actually do any of what needs to be done. And so he splits off, like the group splits. Quentin and Elena go up against Darren, Anna, and Itch, and they both fight to try and actually solve the issues and try and take down the other ones, I guess. I'm not sure. And I can't really remember much of these stories because, again, at the time these were just concepts. I never really developed them past like initial artwork, I'd say. And I do have some artwork on these, but not much. Just a couple of pieces, not really worth showing here. After that, though, we've got the Podunk Punks comic strips. That never went away, because guess what? That is actually Parker Street Punks. Originally it was Podunk Punks, but then I kind of changed it as it went on, and it's Parker Street Punks now, but it's like the exact same thing. The only difference is that it's no longer kids, it's adults just living in the town. So Podunk Punks is exactly Parker Street Punks. It's the same 4 characters, you know? So we've got 2 comics here. One is called Ruin, and one is called Haven. Ruin is actually one that I mentioned back in my more recent video discussing all of my comic ideas, and Ruin was that whole story about 2 brothers that were setting out on this whole like treasure adventure, getting caught up with a black market group, some like mercenaries. Ruin and Haven is actually the sequel to that story, so that's what those ones are about. Gopher, if you guys remember the one sketch that I mentioned back in the art Junkpile video, the way that I had it within this comic universe, there was this huge group called Genesis. Genesis was all about bringing a new world order and trying to essentially create a world economy underground that was just as viable as the upper world, so then they got to a point where they could essentially just wipe out all of the world-renowned countries, you know, and then they would take over and establish new governments. And so all of these stories that I'm going to be talking about for a second, you've got Ruin, Haven, Gopher, and Lone Fox, and those all have to do with that whole idea in that discussing the underground government of Genesis. And Gopher is a really cool one because I had the concept that because it was an underground society, that they would have to completely do everything within black market, and they didn't have currency, so everything was bartered. And so because of that, auctions were extremely common. And so it would kind of be a thing of, you wouldn't buy stuff at auctions, but you would just trade, you know? So it was like, someone was trying to build an army, another guy over there is like, hey, I've got this like ancient historical relic, who wants it? And then he's like, hey, I got 2 tanks, do you want 2 tanks? So then they would do that at the auction. Gopher, his whole character was, he was the Gopher. He worked for these auctions, and his job was to go out and try and pick up some of the items that were going to be sold at auctions. He didn't have to find them necessarily, but he was the guy that was sent out like in a vehicle to go pick them up. And so I thought of this really cool idea where, because they're like super nice fancy auctions, he would go do all of his jobs in suits. And so you'd see him in like car chases, kind of like John Wick, you know? You'd see him in car chases and shootouts and fights in a suit. And I thought that was a pretty cool idea at the time. And then Lone Fox. Lone Fox is pretty cool because it's kind of a loose sequel to the Ruin and Haven comics. Lone Fox is all about a small group of detectives that are actually trying to break some cases on the Genesis Underground Society, and one of the members in that is Evan from the Ruin comic. Evan was the younger brother of Dylan. Dylan was the main character, but he had his younger brother, Evan. And then in Haven, Evan grew up to become a historian and like a world explorer. Then there was a whole thing that happened where they ran into Genesis once again. Something happened along the way where Evan had a son and he got kidnapped. And he just knew that it was Genesis because of his whole history with them. So he joined this detective group, or at least wanted to help them out, because he wanted to try and find where his son went. So he's part of this story, but overall that's just what Lone Fox is about. Next one is Time Vault. This one is pretty cool. It's actually a full graphic novel that is based off of the Podunk Punks. Time Vault is all about them. Like, all of them have been having this issue where like they all get suspended from school, and then all their parents get mad at them. Then they do that typical teenage thing of like, man, I'm sick of like not being able to just live my life the way that I want to live it. So they go out on a camping trip, and then they're just like, man, I just wish that we could just like be somewhere else and just like live our lives, you know, just see ourselves in a different light. And they meet a guy out in the woods, and he hears their wish, and he's just like, hey, I heard what you wished for, is that really what you want? And they're like, sure. And he's like, okay, here you go. And then they wake up and they've jumped ahead 20 years in the future where they actually interact with their older selves. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this is that along the story, there's a character named R.J. Hansen. And R.J. Hansen, he actually died in this story. They go and they're like, well, because like they go and meet their older selves, and then they notice that R.J. isn't around, and then they're like, I gotta tell you something. And so they take him to his grave. And R.J. as a character has always kind of been the one that's more anxious. He has anxiety issues, and he panics a lot because he's kind of one of those guys that like always needs an answer to something, you know? He's not really the adventurous type. He's more the calculated type. He needs to know his plans, you know? And he's like, what? Like I died? Like, how did I die? Like, what happened? And they're like, well, maybe you didn't. I guess we'll see. And he's like, what do you mean? And they're like, you just disappeared. They never found your body. So, like, you were just gone. Just vanished. They make a small remark of like, maybe you never died, you know? And that comes into play later with this. Like I said, this is all a whole universe. Like, all these stories are within the same comic universe. This one is called Casualty. I'm not a fan of the title, but this is actually my apocalypse story that I mentioned in the Junkpile previous to this. Again, this is one of those where like it didn't really go anywhere, didn't really have like a full viable plot. There wasn't like a beginning and an end. It was just kind of like I kept coming up with ideas to the point where I thought like, okay, it could end here, instead of like having a cohesive story. We've only got a few left here. So this next one is called Looters. Looters is all about a group of people like far, far into the future that are a group of thieves that go and I believe So now I'm looking here and I see a number of stories and I'm not sure what some of these are. I do know Punks though. Punks is one that's all about a sci-fi group. It takes place in a sci-fi world and it's just like Earth far in the future. and it's a group of 6 people that all come together, and they try to come together to take down this anarchist group. And I think I wrote it into this canon, saying that they were just taking down. In the future, it becomes the Genesis Corps, because at some point in recent Earth history within this world, the underground society of Genesis got completely wiped out, like they got defeated. But then they had a resurgence later on in the future called the Genesis Corps. So that's what that's all about. And I believe that all these stories, there's Looters, Punks, Footprint, Dog, Earthquake, those 5. I believe that those are all future stories, like futuristic stories that all revolve around that concept of taking down this new reborn version of Genesis. And then the final story, the biggest one with this, is all these stories, they all have a connection back to Westerhill. So if you guys don't remember, Westerhill is actually like my comic universe's version of Hill City. And in fact, I've kept that for my stories now, so like Terranax takes place in Westerhill. But Westerhill was always that town that was considered like extremely special, you know? And Westerhill is where all of these storylines come together and become one thing. So actually, if we look back at Dog, what Dog is all about is there is a team that actually was like able to discover that like they found the creator of the universe. The whole story is about them going and trying to find them. And do you remember what I said about the whole storyline revolving around R.J. Hanson's death within the Podunk Punks? After going through that whole episode of the Time Vault, right, where he goes to meet his future self, that entire experience for him was so like nerve-wracking, and like his mind got destroyed from that. He set out on a quest to try and find that guy again. Because that guy literally just like talked to them, just said like, hey, you want that? Okay, here you go, you can have it. He was like hell-bent on trying to figure out what that was. He ended up running into him again, and he was like, just at least send me to the future. And he's like, what do you mean? And he's like, send me to the future so that I can find you. And he's like, I don't know if you'll find me, but why not? Guess you'll go to the future. So that's why he died. That's why they never found his body or anything, because he was transported to like 2,000 years in the future. And he was part of this group that traveled through space to try and find the creator, and it's Dog. And the whole reason for that is they meet him, and he's like the polar opposite of what anybody thought God would be, like in terms of Christianity and stuff like that. He was like the exact opposite. He was just immature, stupid, used his powers for whatever, would just like create stuff, just be like, oh, you want that? Boom, there you go. And he just like took on this figure of just like this regular guy. And he didn't even have a name, too. Like one of the guys on the crew, just as like a remark, was just like, hey Dog, you got some water? And he was like, what'd you call me? And he was like, I called you Dog. And he was like, it's pretty cool, I like it. Because the big thing is he hated being called God. Because he didn't, like, he had fun creating the universe and it was all just like a game for him. But he never wanted to be a guy that was like idolized. So that's where R.J. Hanson went. And all of this came together at the very end with Westerhill. So what Westerhill is mainly about is Evan's son. You remember Evan Parker from Ruin? That whole thing in Lone Fox where like he was trying to find his son? His son got kidnapped by the leader of Genesis. His name was Chang Di. He was this guy from China who started this whole organization, and he trained him for like a super soldier program. Like he wanted to evolve humans, because when he was going to eventually have his resurgence and try and take over the world, he needed something that was beyond human, so he tried to create super soldiers. Evan's son, I can't remember his name right now. I think it was like William or something like that, but we'll just call him Will. How about that? But Will was kidnapped by Chang, and he spent his entire like adolescence and young adulthood training under this guy and getting experimented on. He basically became a superhero. And so once he got to a point where his training was high enough, he broke out and he got back home. And he knew that Genesis was going to be on his tail. So you had like all the detectives and a bunch of cops that were trying to find this black market society. You have your lineup of superheroes from Artisans who are trying to take down Genesis. Because if you have a black market society that's trying to take over the world, bring a new world order, and superheroes are around, do you think they never would have gotten in touch with superheroes? So they had some of the people that could control elements. And this whole story is just about the final showdown of Genesis. Like this, I wanted the whole comic universe, like the sandbox universe, to be all about Genesis, right? And this whole story is about Genesis finally being taken down. And you know how in the future section it talks about the Genesis core having a resurgence? I wanted the very end of Westerhill to have like all the soldiers that were left over from Genesis to stand up and be like, we will rise once again, and that's how all of my comics end. That was how I wanted the entire thing to end. I always wanted to create a comic universe, and that was what I tried to do with this. Now I want to get into why I didn't do that. Biggest reason why I didn't do that was I had a good concept for creating a comic universe. I just didn't know how to write. And I think I kind of knew that without knowing that, if that makes any sense. Because every time that I had all these stories, I just felt like, man, these just aren't going well. Like, they're just not like ending at the place that I want them to. That was because I didn't know how to develop a story. I didn't know how to craft a story from bare bones. You know, I had no concept of story arcs, plot lines, conclusions. I just like had concepts, and then I was like, I'll put in this because I think it's cool, and I would just continue that story on, kind of like little like beads, you know, just like placing beads one after the other, instead of making a whole sequence that eventually comes back around to itself, like I think a story should. And like I said, eventually I do want to make a video discussing what I've learned from trying to become a writer. That was the biggest thing about these stories. Not only the reason why I gave up on them, but the reason why I don't want to pick them up now is they just don't have the potential to be good stories, because I developed them at a time where my knowledge of writing was very amateur and underdeveloped. And you see that because so many of these stories are highly cliched. So I just decided that creating this comic universe just wouldn't have been good. It might have had some fun parts, but what's most important to me is making a solid story. The writing has to be there. You can't substitute bad writing with cool concepts and awesome visuals and different things like that. Like, those are good to have in a story, but those aren't a replacement. You can't replace the writing with those. Just because the stories might have cool ideas doesn't mean that they're actually stories. This one doesn't have like as much of a message as the last one did. This is more just me discussing where I stand now with my current writing, and what I want to make as sort of a part 2 to this video eventually is I do want to discuss what I think is key for writing a solid story. Might not be the greatest story, and not every story is going to be that way, and I understand that, but I want to create a video discussing what I think are all of the keys to actually making a story, actually crafting one that has a solid beginning and a solid end, you know, keeping in mind stuff like arcs and all of that. And I'll get more into that once I actually get to that video, but for now, I think that's where I want to leave this one off. So we'll pick this up with me talking about some writing tips, I guess. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. This was Carter Sandvin with Sandbox Illustration. Make sure to check in the description for links to more of my content. Then like the video, comment on it, and subscribe for weekly art-related videos. Anyways, have fun, dudes.